everyone. I'm Gil Bashe. I'm your moderator today for this very special webinar. It's a privilege to have these 5 amazing guests who are at the forefront of championing innovation that can improve the human condition. For me, it's a great pride, a source of great pride, both to be connected to these people and to the organization sponsoring. I want to thank today's hosts for their energy and commitment to making these seminars happen. Our thanks to Business France, our thanks to the Gallion Foundation, to FinPartners, and to mHealth Israel. And a special thanks and appreciation to Bruno Cohen of the Gallion Foundation, its Secretary General, and Levi Shapiro, founder and curator of mHealth, Israel's champion, its ambassador, its unofficial and official trade association for health innovators. Disruption or destruction? We're in that period with COVID-19. Today, we're going to hear from 5 outstanding leaders in health innovation, their thoughts about how startup companies, digital health enterprises, health innovators can infuse energy and ideas and promise into Big Pharma. Big Pharma has long been criticized for being too slow, too secretive, not transparent enough. COVID-19 has changed that dynamic. It's brought new light onto the scene. It's made us feel as a society, what can you do to help us? How can you be edgy like Apple? What changes can you bring? The 5 people we have with us today are change makers. They are people who have made things happen rapidly, and they're proven. And we're going to find out in the next 50 minutes what their counsel is to the biggest companies in the world who are facing the world's biggest challenge. Let me introduce them to you, and I'm going to ask them to raise their hand just to acknowledge the introduction. Milind Kamkolkar. Milind is a fantastic person. I've had the privilege of knowing him for some time. He is the Chief Digital Officer of CELLARITY Bio. CELLARITY Bio is one of the hottest companies now in the United States. It's funded by a well-known venture capital company, Flagship Pioneering. Flagship Pioneering is also sponsoring a company in the midst of the COVID-19 struggle, Moderna, and they're all connected. It's a unique model, and I hope that Milind will add something to that. Angela Radcliffe. Angela Radcliffe has an incredible background and story. She is the voice for patient advocacy at CAPGEMINI Invent. And she's not only the voice of patient advocacy for CAPGEMINI Invent, everywhere she goes, she reminds us, ultimately, everything we invent, everything we do is for the sake of the patient. Roy Wiesner. Roy is a managing partner at the aMoon Fund. The aMoon Fund is a noted venture capital firm. It's giving much more than money. It's giving critical advice. Roy, I also want to congratulate you and aMoon. You've just completed a $90 million fund, a new fund, and I know you're going to put that to good use. And I'm hoping during our 50 minutes together, you'll share a little bit of insight of how you make those decisions to deploy those funds. Tal Wenderow. Tal is a proven CEO. He completed a major company in the area of vascular robotics. That company was sold for, I think, Tal, correct me if I'm wrong, a multi-million-dollar price. And now he's on to a new venture, a new important venture. He's the CEO of VOCALIS Health. He is a successful serial entrepreneur in the health space, but most importantly, he's using invention, technology to sustain and improve people's lives. And Alon, he's the founder and CEO of THERANICA. THERANICA is a breakthrough company. I also want to acknowledge Alon. Your company was selected both by Time Magazine and by Fast Company as one of the most innovative companies in the health scene. I note that from the Fast Company write-up that #1 biopharmaceutical innovator was Merck, probably one of the top 3 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. #3 was THERANICA. So you must be very proud. The big and the swift Alon, I'm hoping today that you'll share with us some of the characteristics of why speed is so necessary now, but guess what? And I know Angela's going to add to this, for the sake of the patient, it's always critical. I want to start with Milind. And Roy, pay very close attention to what Milind's going to say, because I'm going to flip from him to you in a few moments. I want to deal with a very hot question, Milind, and I'm asking you to bring a few things to mind. One, you started your career with an Apple spin-out. You moved to the pharmaceutical industry side. From the pharmaceutical industry side, with one of the industry's biggest companies, you jump over to CELLARITY, a hot company that's taking a look at the way cells are created in new ways, and you're the chief digital officer. Obviously, CELLARITY is created with this sense of speed, digital health, change, and science. I'd like to know a little bit from you why you think Big Pharma hasn't embraced the entrepreneurial spirit that companies like Apple or CELLARITY really embraced within themselves to drive change. Give us your experience and insights.
So no easy question for the first round, right? So
No, never. I want to keep you all on your toes.
No, so look, I'll tell you, Gil, I have to say my career, as you pointed out, you know, I got to work with one of the, still to this day, I tell my colleagues at CELLARITY, working with John Couch in those early days of the Human Genome Project, where I was a sequencer before I joined Double Twist, a small Oakland, California company, with Apple folks, was probably one of the proudest moments of my career. Just getting to think, how do you not only build tools for the Human Genome Project, but more importantly, what is the marketplace that gets created as a result of doing that? And that's what Apple does differently. They create marketplaces. The iPad was not a tool. The iPad was a new market creation capability. And that's exactly what they did to why we see it adopted at the level of change that we see it today. I've gone through that period in time of either consulting with Big Pharma, selling software to Big Pharma, all that kind of good stuff. But here's the thing. I actually do have a tremendous level of respect for Big Pharma, despite me no longer being in it per se. I have the respect because as I've had the opportunity to speak with many of my former colleagues, who of course are dear friends now, I've noticed that there is a desired recognition and need to impact the world in whatever small portion of work that they could do. But what I found incredibly discomforting was the boxed in sensation, i.e., well, we hired you to do digital. We hired you to do data. Why do you care about the core business? I think when you're one of those initial catalysts, if you will, who have been brought in to help transform the minds and hearts of people, that actually change is not only a good thing to do, it is absolutely vital for you to do in being relevant to a marketplace. I left both Novartis and Sanofi having had to bash in a few doors, having to potentially leaving some bodies along the way, potentially also disrupting any sacred cows that were held as systems of belief, to then come into an organization like CELLARITY, where actually the motivation was very simple. I wanted to continue to invest in deep sciences. I started my career as a geneticist, and to see where the Human Genome Project has gone so long, I can only say biology is as much a black box as a deep learning algorithm is.
Wow, wow.
We have covered and uncovered certain things. We have so far yet left to go. And the reductionist approach that we take towards understanding target or target selection, the reductionist approach, even in generative chemistry, that we take towards single targets or even polypharmacology, is still only going to provide incremental innovation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, because I see all the work that's being done and the partnerships that are being created as brilliant things. Why? Because this should not be a silver shiny toy. This needs to be normalized as a business capability.
So hold on to that, Milind. Hold on to this for a second. Roy, I want to turn to you for a moment. And I want to pick up on something that Milind just added to us. He talked about creating things that build markets, that what Apple does from his experiences, they just don't invent things or innovate. They actually build whole categories. And looking at this from the sense of a venture fund, where you've invested in two of the companies that are part of this panel. You've invested both in VOCALIS and THERANICA. And you're looking at this from the guise, from what Milind said, you're looking at this from the guise of not just how do you deploy capital and advice, how do you create markets that are nascent right now? Two questions for you. Are you intimidated by doing that? I mean, come on. You know, you're a bunch of people with limited partners, deploying insight, going to proven, albeit proven CEOs, but you're risking capital and time. Tell us, what do you think you're doing that, quite honestly, based on Milind's experience, Big Pharma needs to learn from right now?
I'll start by saying not only are we not intimidated, we are thrilled and excited to be doing that. And we think this is actually very complementary to Big Pharma. And you know, Milind started by saying that he shares a lot of respect to Big Pharma, and so do we. And we think that when you look, and you know, you mentioned the marketplace, I think what also Big Pharma grew to realize that it's not just about the pill, right? You want to look not just beyond the pill, you want to look before the pill, and you also want to look at what's happening while you are producing the pill. And for all of these elements, digital is a key element. So, you know, to give you but a few examples. So if we're talking about the actual drug discovery, right, the bread and butter of pharmaceutical companies, which today experience an ROI on their own R&D of a single digit, when you start employing AI to do so, this holds the promise of really making quite a significant change. When you're looking before the pill, you're starting to think, you know, what can we do as Big Pharma to even expand our market? And I'll give you an example from our portfolio, actually not one of the two companies here. For example, Zebra, one of our companies, you know, AI in the radiology space. So they have developed a bone density algorithm, which uses existing CT scans. And the result that they do, they perform it in order to find out information about bone density. And this can help them then identify populations that are at risk of osteoporosis. So think about, you know, going patients who went for a CT scan, not even for osteoporosis, but then suddenly, this is very relevant for pharmaceutical companies to expand the population. Think about what Tal is doing, and he will, you know, talk about it much in more detail later. But what they do, for example, allows pharmaceutical to understand how the drug that they are providing patients is actually what effect it has in real time. If you imagine, you know, an inhaler that then, you know, you speak out and the company realizes if it works or not.
Roy, can I ask you, I just want to take a spin on that question right now, because you bring up something that has so much common sense and yet has so many perceived obstacles. You're so right. You're so right in your observation. When we combine digital health, digital technology, artificial intelligence, to not only the drug development process, but the sort of the adherence process, the care process, the selection process, it brings so much greater value to the patient process. And Angela, be paying attention closely to this dialogue right now. Why do you think Big Pharma doesn't sort of swoop in and say, you know what, we're not going to be in the tablet business. We're not going to be in the pill business. We're not going to be in the biologic business. We're going to be in the patient cure business. We're going to combine the biology of what we're doing, the genomics of what we're doing, the product development of what we're doing with the information that we can glean from the system. What's the big obstacle here? I mean, what would you tell Big Pharma right now? Hey, folks, listen up. This is a big opportunity to elevate your value and provide a bigger solution to people's health problems?
I think big pharmas, you know, they don't need me to tell them that. I think they already are well aware of that.
But
sorry. No, well, it's not. But I think, you know, it's an incremental change. These things, you know, these are big, carriers that when you want to change their course, it takes time. Versus startups, which are fast boats that, you know, when you steer the wheel 2 degrees right or left, you make a very big change. So, you know, in that sense, I think that pharma is well aware of that. Ultimately, they want to change the patient journey. And I think there will come a point in time, you know, today we're talking about digital health, but ultimately chemical health and biological health and digital health, they will all come together and we will just be talking about health. And this is a process that takes time, like it did in other industries.
Roy, spot on. Angela, I want to get your perspective, because your role at CAPGEMINI event is in a way to be the voice of the patient. I think that what we've just heard from Milind and Roy reinforced the fact that big pharma needs to have power players in it that are actually the ambassador, sort of channeling the aspirations of the patient. What's the disconnect here? Because I think what Roy said about it just being health, just health. It's not digital health. It's not pharma or biopharma. It's not sort of like technology. It's health, the totality of the human being. What's the gap here?
Wow. So for me,
I put you on the spot, didn't I?
That's all right. That's a good spot. It's a good spot to be in.
Okay.
I'm happy to be in the spot of talking from the voice of the patient, right? And for me, I find this huge disconnect starts just in what we see to be true in the players in pharma and what they've come into the industry to do, and then what their day-to-day looks like. So I think most pharma companies will tell you they're not about just coming up with new drugs or medicines to market. They're there to make healthcare a reality for all and to move us from sick care to well care, right? And you hear it in the corporate slogans, but then day to day, I think what happens is people go in and they put their glasses on, their work glasses, and they forget that for most of them, what brought them into this vocation was to impact patients, and that we are patients, every single one of us. I know from talking to the panel, all of us have a healthcare journey or story that caused us to get into this vocation. And that story is with us every single day. And I think that's true of almost everyone in big pharma as well. But we walk in, we put on the glasses for our position, you know, and we forget that signing a contract for a clinical research site to start operations on a trial is delaying the dosing of a patient who could die if they are not dosed quickly enough. I do think pharma is waking up. And I want to harken back to something that was said about incremental versus exponential, right? Both Roy and Milind talked about this. I think pharma is starting to create a more agile cycle around each one of their different functions. So R&D is starting to be more nimble around virtual trials, for example. Commercial is starting to be more nimble around going beyond the pill and digital health. And those cycles, the faster they happen, the more nimble pharma will become. But remember, it's not just about turning a big shift. We're talking about changing business models here. Like there's a dramatic business model shift ahead of big pharma. And I think it's companies like Alon's that will lead the way in doing that, because they'll set the example of what nimble looks like. And those collaborations will start to marry that, just in the same way that we can marry our patient voice and our patient story with our vocation every day, instead of putting those work glasses on.
You know, that's such a great point about maintaining our sense of personal humanity and continuing to bring that into the room. And I think, you know, often people get wrapped up in their corporate position, you know, and the quarterly forecast. And I am going to turn to Alon right now, because I think you said something that's so critical. You know, Alon, you have created very quickly an FDA approved digital device for migraine that has been heralded in the New York Times and Time and Fast Company. I'm curious to get your reaction here, because looking at your category, even the best of what we'll call traditional therapy or tablet therapy, pill therapy, works with this patient population, let's say 60% of the time. Do you think doctors are really ready? In other words, is it just the pharmaceutical companies that are resistant? Or do you think that physicians really also have to be retrained, starting medical school, starting their professional groups, let's say the American Academy of Neurology? Does the medical community in the COVID-19 environment need to be retrained to look not at the process of treating the patient, but actually start from the patient and work back into a process? What's your perspective around this?
I think you're right. I think both communities need to recalculate their route. If we start from physicians, yes, physicians have been educated. They grew up into a world that has kind of was wired to take a pill as a first choice and a second choice and sometimes a third choice of almost every treatment. This is what they studied at school. This is what they see in their day-to-day life, and they grew up in an environment where most of the solutions they practice come from the big pharmas. So there's another part of that where some part of in the back of their mind probably says, well, if it didn't come from one of the big pharma companies I used to work with, maybe it's not the real thing. And yes, they need to be trained again. They need to realize they need to be confronted with facts. And I think, clinical data, evidence-based data can do a good job in that. But I think the contribution of the pharma company is important. I think without that, the medical community by itself is probably not going to be able to make the change. And I think going back to your question, to what you asked Angela, I think the pharma companies, I definitely agree with Angela that in the DNA of these companies, they do think about patients. They're driven by a motivation to help patients, and they do good most of the time. But I think over time, these large companies have grown into conglomerates, and sometimes they are bothered by things that are not patient-centered. It happens, by the way, to large organizations. I can remind you a very famous reaction of the CEO of Nokia at the peak of the success of Nokia, when he was introduced and was requested to respond to the first iPhone. What do you think about this device and how will it influence the mobile phone world? And his reaction was well, it's a nice toy, but it's not a phone, and it's not going to have a lot of influence. And we all know where Nokia, and we all know where Nokia is today and Apple. So it's not only a problem of pharma companies, it's a problem of big companies. And it so happens that most of the pharma companies are so large, they think like giants. I think we can help them. I think we need to work with them, not against them, but with them, to convince them and to help them maybe get over some of their fears. What are they afraid of? When they look at companies like us, like Taz or my company, THERANICA, they are sometimes worried about IP, about patents. They know how to patent a molecule. You have a molecule, it's a chemical formula. You write a patent, you're protected forever, or not forever, but for 20 years. And so they're very much afraid of, well, how am I going to protect IP from the IP standpoint, a waveform, an electrical waveform, or a mechanical apparatus? They don't know how to do that, and we need to help them. We need to show them that some aspects of these developments are perfectly IPable, okay? What else are they afraid of? They are getting used to working in big companies with big money. They suspect everything that is done with not so much money is suspicious in a way the fact that we in THERANICA managed to bring a product to FDA approval and to the market so quickly is almost like a negative parameter in their eyes, because they suspect, how could, I mean, we work on a
How can it be a quality product if you move so swiftly?
Right. And so I think we can help them. I think we can provide them with some arguments that will make it easy or easier for them to collaborate and to streamline. The last thing is, eventually, going back to what I said about Nokia, look, this collaboration is going to happen one way or the other. The thing is, the pharma companies that are going to wait too long and stay behind, they're going to stay behind forever. They're going to be the Nokias of 10 years from now. So that's not a warning, but that's my vision.
Alon, Yogi Berra, the famous US baseball player, said prophecy is hard, especially when we're talking about the future. But I think that your prophecy is something to consider. I mentioned earlier that I took a Twitter poll, sort of designed around the comments you just made. I asked people out there, about 2,200 people responded to my poll. I posted it yesterday. And as of today, as I said, more than 2,000 responded. I asked them 3 simple questions. 1, do you think that that Big Pharma can change? Do you think Big Pharma can change? And do you think it will take a COVID-19 vaccine for you to sort of like say, Eureka, Big Pharma is capable of moving swiftly? And interestingly enough, almost, not quite, almost slightly shy of 50% said, to your point, Big Pharma is incapable of changing. If we look at the combination of it's going to take a vaccine and it can change, it was also slightly more than 50%, those two combined. But I think of who's really in the forefront of potentially inventing a vaccine, it's one of Milind's partner companies, Moderna, which is kind of, I guess you could say to your point, Alon, it's kind of a startup when you look at it, that is both venture capital funded and government funded. So interestingly enough, Tal, I want to turn to you because you have done, you're a serial entrepreneur. You've had a successful exit. And my question is, hearing everybody who's just spoken, you've had to go in and take technology and convince a physician audience in many cases, a hospital system, to embrace technology to improve the human condition. Now you're off on a new venture, VOCALIS. You're combining artificial intelligence. You're combining something that's unique to each of us, voice. And I wanted to ask you a critical question. From the idea conception to actually mobilizing a team, what were the critical steps you did as a working group? Because I think that to Alon's part, and to Roy, and to Angela, and to Milind's point, it takes a team. I'd be very curious to know, as a CEO twice, what do you look for in building a team that's a high-performing team that can get it done?
Yeah, it's always the team, right? Meaning, I see myself as should not be the smartest guy in the room and should be the storyteller, nothing else, right? And obviously make the tough decision. You all know that, right? The easiest decision never come to my level. You know, in VOCALIS, and sorry to correct the pronunciation, we call it VOCALIS. I came, and it's actually that's something that Roy helped me orchestrate and lead, is we merged 2 Israeli startups together to form VOCALIS. So I came kind of like when the team was more established, which is a different problem, right? How do you find the right skill set to the right position and make sure they're all working together? And there's always ego involved, meaning if you go back to what other people here try to say about Big Pharma, to me, ego and the fear of making mistakes is probably the biggest one that's holding them back. But that's true to every company, like Alon mentioned, meaning there is a reason there are startups and there are big companies. That's the nature of innovation or invention.
Why is it the nature then? Tell us.
In my opinion, I'll give you an example. In my previous company, Corindus, which we did the vascular robotics. And by the way, it took us 17 years, right? It sounds, all these stories sounds later on very good. We closed the company almost 3 times. We went reverse merger, IPO, you name it. So in the end of the day, it was sold for $1.1 billion to Siemens, but it's a cycle. But we signed a deal with Philips Healthcare to sell our system initially. Philips is a great partner, but the challenge is most of those big pharma commercial arm, they know how to sell a product when there is a defined need for that, right? And I will compare that to a car salesman, right? If you need a new car, Gil, you say, I need a car. Then the question, do I sell you a Tesla, a Lexus, or Toyota, right? When Alon is selling his product, nobody knows that they need that product. So in the point of sale, that commercial team needs to know to sell the need and the product at the same time. That's something that is not trivial. And you need those special sales guys, special ambassador, and to all the points in the panel, you need to kind of push the limits a little bit, right? You cannot tell the same story, the same playbook that they did at Novartis, that they did at Philips, that they did at Siemens. You need to change your playbook and you need to be creative. And it's hard because the good thing about big companies, in my opinion, whether it's pharma, imaging, or any other medical device, they have their whole full QMS, they have their whole system, they have their whole procedures. We all want that, right? We want to make sure that the drug is 99.9% of the time the right drug.
Yes.
You can bypass, meaning we still work all of us under QMS, the quality management system, under FDA, under CE mark, but you can read it the way you want. And the fact that Alon doesn't need an outside legal counsel and can make a decision like me, it makes life so much simpler. When in big pharma, and Milind probably laughing because he knows that, you need to go to the legal team, which is not reported to the same guy.
I'll stay with that for a second. So I have a question off of that, which is the checks and balances of decision-making, which is, you and Tal and Milind, who are part of entrepreneurial companies, the decision-making process is collapsed. There's not like departments and layers vying and so forth. And so things move faster naturally. Is there a downside to that? Is there a risk to that?
Yes, but I'll say it depends on the personality. That's where the personality of leader need to leverage, to collaborate, and not just make single decision. If you make single decision, you just have to listen before that. And for example, meaning today in COVID-19, everything changed. Roy and I are speaking, and he's on my chairman of my board. We're speaking way too much. We're doing a board meeting every month just to keep an update. And it's not like from surveillance or the bad cop is watching you. It's make sure you make the right decision and can move very fast. So you have to balance that. Sometimes you make wrong decision, but as long as you don't make it twice, right? That's not my statement.
You're talking a lot about trust. I mean, it sounds like for those of you who are connected to Roy needs to build trust with you and you need to build trust with him. What Alon said about speed, what each of you have said, what I'm hearing, it's not only about big and swift or big and small, it's about behavior and mindset. So I'd be curious, Tal, can you share with me in a few words, what's the mindset of a great CEO that's committed to somewhat productive speed?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the mindset is no free time and no vacation, right? I think when I'm at the gym, that's when the good ideas, the problem is I need a different startup to put them in writing, but that's a different story.
So hold that. I want to ask Milind, how do you balance? I mean, I think that what Tal just said is so critical. We've just learned an insight that it's not this versus that. I've been hearing, I hope our audience is hearing that actually what we need to do is not necessarily change the structure of big pharma to perform faster, better. Maybe we need to change the mindset of how people are embraced, how decisions are made, and how executives listen. I mean, Milind, you're an executive at a hot company that's combining both biology and digital health to push out solutions. Is it mindset? Is it process? What's going on?
I think first and foremost, it is absolutely mindset, without question. The mindset that I see, particularly at Flagship, is, in my case, the humility to have Nubar literally ask you 1001 questions to question whether you're really taking the right decision or not, and have you also had the humility to seek external counsel from experts in the field and experts who have done things and don't just say things, who have actually proven their worth. And I think, you know, I think one of the most proudest moments I saw in recent history in pharma making that decision was the appointment of Dr. Aviv Regev as the head of R&D at Genentech, who is fundamentally one of the most prolific scientists introducing single cell to the world of biology, but who is by nature a computational biologist. Just think of that for a second. A computational biologist is the head of an R&D of one of the most innovative organizations in the world, right? It makes you wonder that it just needs, I guess in Genentech's time, 20 plus years to get there, right? But it's okay. That's absolutely okay. I think likewise, the other mindset that you need to have. We face today decisions that are made, particularly in pharma, on playing to not lose. Very different to playing to win.
Hold on to that 1 second, because Roy, I'm going to be turning to you in a moment, because you deploy capital and you obviously invest in some companies that score and some companies that, to Tal's point, there were times where his other venture almost didn't make it. So I'm going to be turning to you next. Milind, please continue with that thought, because this concept of playing to win, playing to lose, or not to lose, is about, sort of, I'll say, embracing the adventure and sort of like trying to protect yourself from disappointment.
I think it's also trusting the people you have. Fundamentally about trusting your team. When you hire superstars, I'm very blessed with the kind of team I've had the privilege of growing from scratch. To me, the one thing I tell my team is I hope that I'm not around in 5 years' time and I've grown you guys as the next level of awesome leadership, right, in this company. And I think, you know, to differentiate between those two, let me be specific. Playing to not lose is when you assess what you have today and consider what you can invest in incrementally to do that little bit better next year, okay? You will have an incline, and depending on your risk appetite, it's either going to be very steep or it's going to be minimal, but the opportunity to improve is still there, right? Playing to not lose is when you define destinations, and then you ask yourself, what sacred cows do I have to absolutely annihilate to get to those destinations? That comes with a bigger risk. That does come with a bigger risk. But if you trust your team and you trust the advice that you're getting with the humility that's required to get there, but with the passion to drive and build, you will not only invent, but you'll innovate accidentally along the way.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Roy, I said I was going to turn to you. You know, from my own years in private equity venture capital, I learned something, and I'm curious to get your thought. Sometimes investment groups invest more in teams than they do in the actual core idea. Milind just talked to us about trust, about mindset, about adventure. Can you talk a little bit about the mindset that you and your managing partners have, the principals have, as you make a decision to invest in a CEO? What are you looking at beyond the business plan? And what do you think, let me make it harder for you, because you're used to being sort of in the tight spot. What do you think Big Pharma should learn from you?
I'll start by saying that, you know, it's interesting that we talk about trust, because aMoon means trust in Hebrew. And, you know, it's for a reason, because it's really the basis for a lot of the discussion around here, right? It's the trust between the investors and the startups. It's the trust between the pharma and the patient, between pharma and startups. So I think it's really the sort of the underlying building block that needs to.
Did you and Milind coordinate this so that he would deal with trust and you could deal with aMoon?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And I think, and I'll mention, by the way, that we as aMoon, we also have collaboration with Big Pharma. I mean,
tell us about that. Tell us about that.
But to answer your question, I think there are a number of sort of traits that we look for, especially in the CEOs, and, you know, knowing Alon and Tal, you know, I can attest that it's part of who they are, that could definitely also be beneficial for Big Pharma. So one is, and we heard it here in the conversation, they are dissatisfied with the status quo. I mean, they will not take the status quo as something that they should be content with or marginally improve, they find a problem and they're saying this needs to change. So that is one thing. I think the second element is that they move quick. You know, there's a saying, they start as fast as they can, and then they accelerate. And this is something which I think for startups to really be able to be very nimble, to move very quickly, and to use that advantage of being the race boat, this is something that could also benefit big pharma. And maybe the last thing I'll mention is that they are very comfortable with change and uncertainty. So Tal mentioned his roller coaster at Corindus. This is a roller coaster that involved a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of pivoting involved. There are changes that need to be made, and they are comfortable doing that. So they, you know, each time this happens, they approach it as an opportunity rather than as a disaster that now, you know, you need to just handle somehow and move forward. No, they look at what's at stake, what's currently the situation. They want to change it dramatically, and they will turn every obstacle into an opportunity to really to innovate and take themselves even forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. No, Angela, I was thinking of this whole concept of the mindset, and you know, I've been reflecting on the decades that I've been privileged to be involved with I'll call it all health, big pharma, providers, payers, patient groups, policymakers, the gamut. And I hear a lot with startup companies, this culture of thinking about who we're innovating for, who we're inventing for, who we're innovating for. I sometimes wonder, to Milind's opening comment about Apple, which they sort of like invent for the market.
Yeah.
Do you think big pharma, from your perspective as a consultant of looking at patient issues, do you think big pharma is really looking at, despite their desire, when they're sort of getting down to what Roy and everybody has been talking about, this drive to create, to overcome obstacles, do you think that they're thinking of like Mrs. Smith with a certain illness in mind, or the Mrs. Smiths or the Mr. Smiths involved? Has big pharma lost sight? Are they looking at it in terms of the market, to what Milind sent? And I know Milind talked about this in terms of Apple, not in terms of Milind. But do you think big pharma has sort of lost that clarity? And whereas with startups, they're often driven to some form of outcome, like drive to the outcome, crash through the obstacles, press forward. What's your thoughts here?
I think the perception is that business leads and humans come second. And I don't think that's actually true. You know, hearkening to this conversation on mindset, one of the things that I found so interesting, so I sit on a standards body with a couple of people from big pharma. And one of the things that we've invented in our working group is this concept of minimum viable bureaucracy. So forget MVP, and I'll have to give credit.
That's a poster. That's a poster, right?
Right? We said, you know, we're not striving for, you know, MVP here, we're striving for minimum viable bureaucracy. And we're creating standards. And when you think about creating standards, it seems counterintuitive to removing bureaucracy, right? And moving fast. But I found that in pharma, that we forget that we're dealing with creatives when we're dealing with scientists. These are people who at their very DNA are there to invent. And the best thing we can do for creative people, and if any of you are parents, you can understand this, right? When you give your creative child some structure, they're much more creative because they know the boundaries. And people have often said to me, life science is the hardest industry because you have to be creative, but in a box. So no out of the box thinking, it's in a box, and that box is made up of compliance and regulatory and what have you. I think that sometimes we focus too much on the box and we forget that the box is there to help force us into pairing that human perspective and that business need. So you're right. I think to an extent we've lost that a little bit, but in my experience, I see us starting, and I thank the panelists who are part of both the VC and startup community for sort of leading the way and reminding us you can be creative in this box. And that structure can be effective and helpful, but you have to be willing to commit to MVB, minimum viable bureaucracy, and you have to be willing to give people the space to explore and do it from the human perspective and not the business perspective.
Thank you. It's, I think we forget that when Apple, sort of Apple goes at this, it treats its inventors actually as creatives. A touching story I remember, though, is during the creation of the first statin drugs, Dr. Vagelos, who was then the chief science officer of Merck, would go into the lab. They were failing time and time again. And he was more of a motivational force working next to them on the bench to sort of keep them going as their energy was being depleted. He was that chief creative officer. I wonder if we call a chief science officer if we're actually doing those people a disservice. I mean, Milind talked about appointing someone at Genentech, one of the edgiest Apple-like biopharmaceutical companies in the world. And what do? They choose someone out of the box to lead their science. Tal, I want to transition over to you. You said something that we don't really hear enough about, which is like at the precipice, at the cliff of failure. And I want to return to that because so much of what we're talking about of infusing digital health spirit inside of big pharma is not about scientific process. It's about approach. It's about culture. It's about nurturing. It's about being creative. Can you talk about what your role was when you were like that close to the brink of putting the key in the door and locking the door? What did you do as a leader to keep people inspired creatively? To Angela's point, what did you do to keep people like, we're going to keep on doing this until they kick us out of this office?
Yeah, so first it started at home, right? I have to tell my wife and kids, but I think the key words for me was transparency. We just had to be always transparent with the team and with the board. It goes ups and down in the organization. When you do that, and to go to that notion of mindset and team, people realize there are sacrifices along the way, but if you just have to grind through in a way, right? It sounds easier than it actually is. And, we had a day at Corindus that we had actually let go of 10 or 15% of the workforce. And it's people with families. It's never easy. But unfortunately, it happened also to big companies without any personal touch point. There's no better way to describe that, right? But you just have to work with the people and explain them, and people realize that. I mean, especially in the COVID era today, people understand that. To me, by the way, going back to the thought about a mindset, I don't think, it sounds like we're all criticizing big pharma, and I don't think that's the case of any of us, right? I think the ability to look from outside in is always easier. And we embrace them because we need them, as Alon mentioned, we need them to drive the market, to pure some marketing dollars, and change behavior cannot come from a startup, right? It will never come from a startup. You need that big workhorse. The difference is, I think we're closer to the customer, whether the CEO, the chief data, or even the technician speak with the customer directly all the time. When you have a big organization, the layers that you are remote from the customers are key. And in digital health, it's all about the customer, right? And the customer can have multiple hats. And I think that's kind of the beauty that startups can bring is work with the customer all the time, change fast, react fast, and just, I made a mistake, that's gone, right? It's not like I did a clinical trial of $90 million that now I need to justify why I need to repurpose the drug in order not to lose my budget for next year. We don't think like that. And I think that's part of that mindset. It's inherent, and that's the reason we have startups, VCs, and big pharma. Otherwise, you cannot drive invention or innovation and change that behavior, because it's all about, to me, is, again, it's the customer. And I'll give kudos to big pharma, and Milind mentioned Novartis. They are the first one. Understanding digital health is a bridge to the customer. And I understand that can help me reach the customer before and after the pill. The same analogy go to insurance company, right? They used to sell life insurance and they care only after you die. No, they realize you have to support the customer through that process till he actually passed away. I think pharma right now.
You said something that is an underappreciated word. And well, you said three things, and I want to summarize because I think not of our panel, we have some time left, but you said three things that I think were really critical. And I hope that everybody listening in gives a lot of thought to, whether they're from a large company or a startup or anything in between. You talked about clarity or transparency, the need for the leader to be clear and transparent with the community and with the board. Now, and that's that, to Roy's point, aMoon, trust, building trust with everybody. So you talked about clarity. You talked about collaboration, that often we're looking at the marketplace as a competitive marketplace, but you talked about looking at big pharma and other segments, the provider, other segments, the payer, the other segments of the market as opening up your eyes for the potential of collaboration among them, having sort of an expansive rather than a restrictive mindset. And then you talked a lot about the customer. Those three C's: clarity, collaboration, customer, constantly keeping focus on the customer. I think that those are three critical insights that this group conversation sort of boils down to. I want to flip to Alon for a second because he like you is pioneering a new area of approaching pain. Historically we've looked at medications, we've looked at physical therapy, we've looked at medications, and now he's pioneering actually a new form of digital and medical device health. And I want to ask him, since you received initial funding from the same aMoon source, I want to ask Alon to verify your thoughts and also talk about those three C's: clarity, collaboration, and the customer. Alon?
Yes, I think that all of these C's are critical. That's another C, critical. But I think if you mention aMoon and similar VCs, I'd like to go back to something that Milind said and maybe sharpen it a little bit, because Milind talked about playing not to lose. I'd like to elaborate a little bit about that and say something about aMoon and the way they think. It's more about, I would say, about risk management. Nobody likes to lose. Failure is a bad thing, normally. You don't enjoy failing, but if you make the motto of never fail, the mission or the way you live, the way you work, the way you design things, you can't really achieve anything. In almost all cases, by the way, not only in pharma, in other industries, in sports, in art, in music, in everything, you have to risk in order to obtain, in order to achieve, in order to fulfill. And so it's about risk management. How much do you risk? What is the cost? What is the penalty? If the risk is the life of a patient, you're not going to take this risk. But if the risk is, failure, a financial failure, depending on the size and depending on the context. And I think that one of the great merits of aMoon is a proper risk assessment. On one hand, they're not adventurers, and I have to testify that the due diligence that we had to go through to get their money was the longest and most tedious I've had in my life. But I remember a point in time when I sat down with it wasn't Roy, it was another guy from aMoon called Todd, and we had a very close conversation, and he asked me a lot of questions about how are you going to do this and that, and I had to say, look, I don't know. I'll have to figure out. I don't know. And he looked me in the eye and I told him, look, I don't know. You have to take a risk. You have to decide if you take the risk. If you trust me, based on what we achieved so far, that we will figure out how to do whatever you're asking. And it was the aha moment, I think, for him and for me, because a couple of days later, he came back and said, yeah, we're going with you guys. We're taking the risk. So it's all about risk management, really.
Thank you. It's interesting because a story that Roy Vagelos, who is one of the real leaders within the pre-Gallion community, he took over really a very central role and continue the legacy from Elie Wiesel, who was the honorary chair and founder of Gallion. Roy once told me a story about Mike Rosenblatt, who's currently on the committee for the Gallion Foundation, is chief medical officer of Flagship Pioneering. Mike invented the medication, one of the people invented the medication Fosamax. And they were presenting to the board of Merck the NDA science around Fosamax. And Roy asked Mike, and he said this in public, so I'm not speaking out of turn. He turned to Mike and he said, Mike, are you sure you're ready to present to the board? And Mike said, yeah, Roy, I'm ready. And Roy said, that's good, because if this doesn't work out, you're fired. And, you know, I think we forget that we are accountable. It's not that, you know, perhaps the risk-benefit ratio is different in startups. We're accountable ultimately. So I want to turn to Roy for just a second. I want to maximize our time and also answer a few of our audience questions. There are many. Roy, from a startup standpoint, you know, it's not keep on going forever. How do you hold people accountable, like Big Pharma holds people accountable? How do you, in an innovative environment, define accountability?
We define accountability, you know, when we invest in startups, ultimately, we also have a set of expectations, you know, that we set together with the founders. The goals that they need to reach, the milestones, and, you know, everything is again measured against that. I think it's always reflecting a consistent conversation with the company, and being also very clear of where we expect them to get. It's also their expectations from us, by the way. You know, it's a two-way street in that sense. But I think things are very clear, you know, ahead of an investment round, when we're saying, okay, these are the attainable milestones. This is where we believe you need to get with this money, and this is where we want to see the company getting, or, you know, the goals that it will reach ultimately. And we constantly, you know, measure, and we constantly recalibrate things because also things happen along the way. It requires to make changes. So it's also a constant dialogue.
It sounds like you're reconfirming what Tal said. It's about, you know, clarity and collaboration and maintaining that. And obviously you respect your CEOs to maintain a focus on the customer. So I want to actually ask all of you some of the audience questions that, you know, obviously audiences that are on the Q&A function, and I thank them for adding their questions. They have some of the toughest questions. So I've looked at those questions while we're speaking. And one question I want to direct to Milind, which is the expectation of the stock market and sort of Big Pharma's sort of feeling that it has to answer to share price, to the PE value. How does that influence behavior, and how does that influence vision? I mean, you're on both sides of the equation, Milind. What do you think? What's your advice to all of us?
Mm-hmm. Look, once you decide to go the route of going public, you do have a responsibility. Even if you're private, of course, you have a responsibility to your investors. So you're not ever devoid of showing a return and value creation to the people who are graciously believing in your outcomes. But it is about outcomes, right? It is about driving outcomes that are based in evidence and value. I find if you're a startup person, or even just as a digital analyst in a new digital team sitting in a big pharma company, the number one thing I would urge you to not do is to talk about just how great your ML is, or just how great your your new app is, and God forbid another patient diary. What I would recommend instead is go in there and start talking about the economic benefit of what you can drive as value. And specifically how that value is, I guess the clarity again, right? Who is your customer? Having absolute laser sharp focus. Who is customer? Who is paying for this? How is this going to be monetized in the industry? And last but not least, how do you plan to evolve this if you in fact plan to create a sustainable business? there's a lot of companies, I think COVID unfortunately has uncovered a lot of vulnerabilities in the startup ecosystem, specifically those that were looking to get quick exits, right? And I think what you're going to find now is a cleansing and a very much a required cleansing of the market to be able to then justify, well, what is truly creating value in the DTX community, digital therapeutics, and how those are becoming now part of the overall process and strategy of a launch. Could be a pill or could be towards the benefit of a preventative endpoint or a treatment endpoint. And I think if you really think about that from a shareholder value, those are the kinds of things where it's evidence-based on those parameters, you know, customer, how it's going to be paid, and how will it scale. Those are the things that are going to drive market benefits in share price or otherwise.
Thank you, Mil. Now, Roy, one of our questions comes from a person by the name of Dawn, and she asks about the role of resource constraints and existential threats that innovation are facing. Roy, from your perspective, you know, capital, finance is so critical to these companies. Do you think we're in a period because of COVID-19 right now that the startup community is facing threats it never thought possible?
I think things have changed. I mean, following COVID, I think that the venture capital community, you know, is looking at each investment with even more, you know, magnifying glass to make sure that it makes sense. I think there was a lot of inward focus about the portfolio. And, you know, at the same time, and also to go back to what Milind says, there is, you know, a certain cleansing happening in the sense that, you know, you look at the investment opportunities, and maybe it's going to be tougher for companies to raise funds also based on, you know, certain valuations that were in place prior to COVID, because suddenly, you know, the world has changed in many ways. So I think it's going to, on the one hand, to be more difficult for certain startups, but for other startups which have built themselves right, which have the right value proposition, which have really a breakthrough technology, which put all the, you know, building blocks in place, actually, this is a great opportunity for them to accelerate further. So I think you need to be worried where, you know, worry is due, and you can be optimistic where optimism is due. And this, a lot of it depends on what you've done in the years prior to COVID.
That's fantastic. You know, Angela, a question in response to something you said earlier. You know, people are finding that in this environment of COVID-19, our expectations or our experience of life is changing radically. Do you think that the life science sector is sort of taking a look in the fact that we're being digitized before our very eyes? How we order food, how we buy stuff, you know, when we look outside our door and there are packages or no packages. I mean, digital is, we've been transformed digitally. Do you feel that our industry, big and small, is starting to understand that everything is becoming digitized? From the patient's perspective, do they get it?
I think they're starting to get it. And I think this panel is an excellent picture of the ecosystem that is right at our fingertips now, right? So, you know, I'll tell you a personal story, right? I have a university-age daughter. She's suffering terribly from migraines for the last 6 months.
You know who you should speak to right after this call? Alon.
And I have, and I have. And so let me tell you that the impact of this digitalization of this world. While Milind and his company are racing to find faster discovery pathways that could come up with something completely different for migraine. Meanwhile, Alon has come up with a new way to manage pain through a device. Meanwhile, we've got Tal, whose conversational research might someday help me know, say from a voice conversation with my daughter, that she's suffering more than she's willing to tell me. And we've got aMoon investing in this ecosystem all around. And so the impact of that on my own personal family, and this is the human aspect we have to keep close, is now my daughter has a new device beyond the pill that may help her pain. I may have a new way to communicate with her, being distant from her while she's in university, to know I can support her. And there are things that are going to be discovered faster than they ever were before. And the impact of that is much broader than my daughter's suffering. The impact of that is a child who may never have to take an opioid pain medication, may never become addicted, may never end up homeless. That is a broad impact that this ecosystem is creating, and it takes all of us. So I really think that this COVID experience is helping us remember the community we're part of. And if we can just keep that human experience at the center and know we're all contributing, it's powerful stuff, I think.
What a statement, Angela, of bringing this panel together and acknowledging the four other people on this panel, that really we're part of an ecosystem that is sort of improving health. And actually, these sort of conversations reduce the fragmentation that really enable us to champion health innovation and bring it to people and improve the human condition. Bravo. I want to ask each of you one last question, and in a sentence or two, give me your thoughts. And I want to start with Tal. I'm going to move over to Alon, then Roy, then Angela, and then Milind. So I want to ask you this question. And this will be not an easy question, but a fair question. Your advice to all the listeners today, if you were to name 2 qualities of leadership that can really accelerate the innovative mind, what 2 things would you recommend to leaders of companies, large and small, throughout the health ecosystem, whether it be payer or product innovator or policy decision maker or patient group or provider, regardless, 2 things to keep in mind that could make things better for the human condition? Tal, I'm starting with you.
Yeah, only 2 is tough, but you know, innovation, in order to innovate and disrupt, you have to make a change, right? So that's kind of like counterintuitive to most people. So if you see a high cliff, that means your innovation will be bigger. So
yes.
As simple, if I try to summarize, is listen and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Bravo.
If you do those 2, but I'll stop here. And by the way, Angela, great job of summarizing.
Good qualities.
Stop after Angela, last comment.
Good qualities. Alon, 2 qualities you'd recommend to people who are looking to follow in your footsteps. What would you say they need to think of? And don't repeat Tal.
Yeah, which is difficult because what he said is true. But I would add 2 things. I would say think disruptively. Think about the problem you're trying to solve and try to define the whole system and think where the system has been too conservative. What hasn't been creative? What has been there for too long? Try to disrupt there. So that's number 1. And number 2, make sure you work with people that share with you the belief in the final target. Not necessarily pick the team members that have the best talent or the best experience, but the people with whom you can really share the vision.
Beautiful, beautiful. Roy, what do you think about your 2 CEOs? Have they taught you something or just reconfirmed?
I think that they made my life more difficult because I wanted to say the things that they said. But since now I have to say something else, I would say that 2 other qualities are being able to articulate a vision, because ultimately, you know, we were talking here about change. And in order to create a change, you need to be also a storyteller, in a sense of, you know, people listening in and saying, you know what, that makes sense. We want to be on board. We want to join this ride. So to me, this is something which is a very like a soft skill, but it's an important one. And maybe the other one would be to keep the right balance between being, you know, optimistic and dissatisfied. So you want to be dissatisfied with, you know, the current status quo, with things that you don't think are going right, but you also want to be optimistic, not just radiate, you know, negativity, but saying, okay, so this is what can be done and will be done.
Beautiful, thank you. Angela, your perspective, please.
You know, I think it's two qualities that you, Gil, demonstrate in your work as well as our sponsoring organizations for today, and that is empathy. Empathy in everything we do, you know, and empathy that's paired with humility is even better. And courage, right? I mean, we're going into big places, big systems, and tackling big problems, and courage. Wow. And the courage to do that from a place of empathy and humility, that to me is a good formula.
You certainly said you're a role model on those. Thank you. Milind, you kicked us off. I gave you a tough question. I apologize. I'm leaving you with a tough question because we've heard so many amazing qualities we've got to put in our tool bag in order to succeed going forward. What are your two thoughts?
Sure. So I had the benefit of listening to everyone, so thank you for that. It was, and Angela, again, ditto. That was brilliant. Thank you for connecting all the dots. I would say the first thing I would ask people to consider is to really listen, empathize, and know your customers and collaborators, both from an internal and external perspective, big company or otherwise, because only together you're going to solve this problem. No one group alone can solve it. But number two is probably something we haven't talked about yet, but it's something that keeps me up at night, every night, on this. And this is, don't forget about the cures for the accidental dystopia you create.
Wow.
Right? Because I don't think the iPhone ever anticipated separation of spousal relationships over a period of time. They didn't anticipate that. But guess what? How much time do we spend on a phone? Now we're creating apps for that. Likewise in digital health. I am a patient on one of the Apple Watch studies with MGH after open heart surgery in March of last year. I can tell you that I am now a patient advisor to the very folks that once upon a time I would have led had I been in a pharma company, and realized just how many stupid mistakes I made in doing that. Now sitting on the other side as someone who is working towards a better life.
Fantastic.
All of those things.
Thank you. First, I want to thank our panelists for an incredible, candid conversation. To Roy, to Tal, Alon, Milind, Angela, we cannot thank you enough. If people listen to this broadcast again and again, they will get a university semester towards success. So thank you all very much for your candor and your advice to all of us. I also want to thank our sponsors again. I want to thank Business France. I want to thank the Gallion Foundation. I want to thank Fin Partners and mHealth Israel for sponsoring this webinar. A fantastic conversation due to you. And last, I want to thank two people specifically. I want to thank Bruno Cohen of the Gallion Foundation and Levi Shapiro from mHealth Israel. Thank you for your leadership in bringing us together. Everyone, we wish you success and health, and let's continue to do exactly what our panelists have suggested. Let's go out and change for the better of the human condition. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.